Hello, my name is Jean-Christophe, and today we're going to talk about Python requests. We're going to look at the Python request library and how we can use it to make GET and POST requests to a web server. So you can find all the information on this video at my blog using the Python request path. What we're going to have to do first is to install Python and the required packages. So you can look how to install Python in your machine here. And you can also install these requests in your terminal by using pip. Then we're going to cover what are the basic method that you can use with requests. So we're going to make GET requests and POST requests. So the way the web works is by calling a web server, you make a GET request to the web server in order to receive the content from that page. And you can use POST requests in order to add stuff to a web server. For example, when you post a status on social media or whenever you fill a form. But in this situation, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do these things by using Python instead of the browser, for example. So let's make the first simple GET request. The first step is to import the request library. And then what we do is we initialize a response variable, and we are going to use the request library and the get method from the request library in order to add a URL. So the URL we're going to define here, which is crawler test, that I'm using because it was built to experiment on your crawler. So here what we want to do is we want to print the URL. We want to print the response status code, and we want to print the response headers. Here you can see that when you run this, you can see that you've successfully fetched the page. It returned a 200 status code, and you have the HTTP headers here. There are other things you can do, like making a post request. So in order to make a post request, what you do is, again, we're going to use another website that was used to help you experiment on post requests, and we're going to define what we want. So for example, let's say we want to fill in a form with my own information in the form. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the requests library, but I'm going to use the post method instead this time, and I'm going to fetch the URL. But this time I'm going to add the data parameter and add the payload to the parameter. And then I'm going to look at the response JSON coming from it. And now what you can see is that my last name, first name, and website were added to my post request. So this is how you use the post request. Now let's look at the method and attributes. So let's come back to get request, and for the rest of this tutorial I'm going to focus on get request. So we import a request module and we define what URL we want to crawl. So in this case I'm getting the same URL again, and I'm making the requests get to the URL. This time we want to know, okay, what can I do with this response? So if I look at the response, I run this, I can see that, okay, it's 200. But what does it tell us? In order to investigate what is inside this, you can use the help method and look at the response. In that case, you get all the information about the methods that you can use, the attributes and stuff like this, like the descriptors and what they mean. So now we know that, we're gonna mostly focus on the one that I think are important for beginners. So we're gonna look at some data descriptors and attributes, and we're gonna look at the JSON method. So in order to access attributes, the way we do to access attribute is usually using the dot notation and the name of the attribute. So for example, when we want to look at the status code again, we can run this and it's a 200 status code. We can look at the text, which will return the content of the page in a string format. or we can look at the content, which return the response in bytes format, which the B the notation tells you that it's in bytes. Or you can again look at the response headers. But we also can do other very cool stuff by doing this. Is we can look out for redirections, for example. So if you build a crawler, you may want to follow the redirections, and you may want to see from where it started to where it went. So let's look at that URL that is creating some redirections and see what's happening. So we make the request, and then what we want to look at the response history attribute. That gives you a list with the response, each of the response. So what you want to do here is create a for loop that would say for each redirect in redirect history, in the response history, print the redirect URL and the redirect status code. And then you print the end URL on which you ended up. So then you get that redirect chain that you see that we started from this one, we were a 301 redirect, and then this one, and then we ended up on the target, which returned a 200 status code. There are other things that you can do. You may want to disable this. So if you build a crawler and you don't want to follow redirects, for example, you can just use the allow redirect parameter and set it to false. In this case, what we're going to do is just fetch the first URL and don't bother with the rest. If you want to access to a method, you access this with the dot notation again, but this time you use the parenthesis in the end to access it. What's happening here is that we're not fetching JSON, we're fetching HTML with the previous page. But whenever we call an API, usually we return something like the JSON. So if we fetch this, and this time, since we're fetching an API, if we use the JSON method, we can actually show what's on the page. So if you go to that URL into your browser, you're gonna see this on the page, and that's how we fetched it with the request. So now we've learned the methods and attributes. We're gonna start trying to process the response. So in order to process that response, what we're gonna build is we're gonna recrawl the URL, which is crawler test, and we're gonna get that URL. So if we look at the art text, so we can see that we have the content of the page here. But this is a string, so you cannot do anything with that string. So what you want to do is you want to import BeautifulSoup from BS4. And BeautifulSoup, what it does is it actually parses the page. And parsing is it will try to understand each of the HTML tags and where they sit. And in order to parse the response from that page, we're gonna create that soup object, and we're gonna call the BeautifulSoup and put in the response text that we had. And we're gonna define this as a HTML parser to be able to parse that response. And then when we look at that soup, instead of getting I made an error, joy of live coding. So when you look at that soup, you can see each of these tags now is understood it's well understood with each of these tags, and now you can start to do things like getting the soup title, for example. So what you can do is you can use the soup find method, and then you try to get the title from the page. And by doing this, you can see, okay, cool, I get the title. So we can see that that the soup object can help you understand the content of the page. You can also use the find all method to look at the meta tags, and then you can see you have a lot of meta tags. And if you want to go deeper in this and just select, for example, the meta description here, you can select some of the attributes from this by using this attributes description, and you select the name is equal to description. So you use a dictionary to say which attributes you want to do, and in this case you're just selecting the description and not all of them. And you can potentially just select the first meta description if that's what you want, and there it is. So now that we know this, what we're gonna do is try to go a little bit deeper by finding all the SEO tags on the page. So we're gonna start again and put that kind of startup and parse the page, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna set up the soup find the titles that we've just discussed. We're gonna try to get the title, we're gonna try to get the H1, we're gonna get the description, the meta description, what you see on Google when you search for a web page. We're gonna get the meta robots, which define if a page is indexable, and the canonical tag, which defines what is the important page, what is the good version of a page. So what you can do is, for example, you can find title, you can find the H1, and you can select some of the meta attributes that we've discussed, like the name description that we just discussed, or the name, instead of having the name description we can use the name robots, and we can use and for example we can find the link which has rel canonical. So cool. So now we have all of this. Let's look at what the description look like. So we have a list. So we have our meta description, and what we want to select is not the actual entire tag. We want to select the text from the description here. So what we want to do is we want to use the description content. So then we can easily select this, and this is possible because of BeautifulSoup. We may want to select something else like the title, and using the get text method, because the title doesn't have the same HTML tag. If we look at the title, it's in there. So what we want to use is, instead we want to use the get text method in order to get that text within it, compared to the content which we wanted to have the attribute from the page. But what happens is, if we want to have a canonical href and it doesn't exist, so what will happen here is we're going to have a non-type saying that it's not scriptable. So what we want to do here is, instead of just calling the text, instead of just calling it, we want to put a if else. So if the title exists, else do something and remove it. If the description exists, get the content, else do nothing. And then what we want to do is repeat the process for the canonical and the description, and we want to repeat the process for the meta robot tags and for the H1 that we just defined. So we have all of these. We want to set up these into variables. So bear with me here. I'm setting up my variables. Description equals canonical and meta robots equals. So in this case, whenever I'm trying to print all my tags here, what will happen is instead of throwing an error, it will just return the tags with an empty string. So this is the kind of things that you want to do. So building a crawler is not simple. You have to think of all these use cases where it can break. Now let's try to get all the links on the page. So we are still going to import the beautiful and request package, but this time we're also gonna import a new no, not right now. Let's start and make the request to the URL and parse again the page like we just did. What we want to do is do something like to find all the links on the page. What we're going to use is the find all method that we just discussed about, and we're going to try to get the A tags. What will happen here is we're probably gonna get a lot of A tags that are not related to links but images. So if you just want to have the actual links and not the images links, then you set up the hrefs equal to true. And then what you can do is you want to extract the link here from the href tag. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to loop through each of the tags. So for link in soup find all, and we're going to initialize a links list that we're going to append the links to. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, print the link href. So here what we're gonna do is this. Let's run this and say, okay, print the link href. Okay, now I have those links, but these are relative URL. They don't contain the domain name. So what we want to do here is we want to import your lib parse and import URL join. And URL join, what it will do is if the href is not in there, if the domain URL is not in the link, it will append it to it, and if it is in there, it will not. So it will provide you to it will help you combining these links. And then instead of printing, we're gonna append it to the URLs, and then what we're gonna do, we're gonna print the first 10 links. So now that we run this, you see they're not relative URL but absolute URL now. So this is what you want to do because you want to keep crawling the web, so this is very useful. So we've covered a few of the things that we can do using the request library. Now what we want to do is to make sure that we handle errors. So for example, if I get a URL that is badly formatted, so this doesn't exist, we cannot fetch that page. So if we make a request to that page, we're gonna get an error thrown off to us saying, okay, that URL doesn't exist. So what sometimes you may want to keep crawling the web. You don't want your crawler to break just because of one URL that is badly formatted. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna wrap this in a try and except, and it's always good practice. So as you start building using this library, you will always use that try and except exception as try and except solution in order to prevent those errors, and then you are saying, okay, print the error. So in this case, what you're trying to do is, okay, but you can keep doing things. So if you just want to say print this, in this case, you realize that your code can keep running even if you hit something that breaks it. So this is a very good practice to have. Then the next thing is you may want to change your user agent. So you can look at what is your user agent and define and find out what it is. This is mine. So what you want to do is if you want to add a user agent to your response, because some application will require a user agent to be available, then you set up your headers and you go in your headers and you use a user agent and you define it as your user agent. And then when you make your requests URL, then you define the headers as headers, and that's it. So you define your response, and you can show the JSON from the response, and you're gonna see that it worked. And whenever Reddit look at their logs, they're gonna see that I came and try to scrape their page. So this is a good practice to always define who is your user agent whenever you use a web crawler. You may want to add a timeout. So if a page takes 10 hours to load, you may want to skip that page. And the way you're going to skip that page is, again, let's follow the good practice and put the exception in there and print the exception if there is an error. And now what we're gonna say is we're gonna try to get that make that request, but this time what we're gonna do is we're gonna get the URL and we're gonna add a timeout in case the page takes too long to load. So whenever we make that request, we can say that, okay, cool, there was an error, and the error was because I put a connect timeout error into there. So this can be useful to build a crawler that is efficient and doesn't get stopped in the loop because a page doesn't want to load. Now, next you may want to use proxies. So use a different IP than yours to crawl a website. This can be useful for black hat people, or it can be useful to scrape a website that doesn't want you to scrape it. So what you can do is actually you set up the proxy HTTP to the IP that you want it to be, and then you make that request get URL and you define the proxy as proxies. Wow, I write really well here. Proxies as proxies, and then you can make that request. Okay, we've kind of covered this, adding headers to the request, but this can be very useful whenever you fetch an API that requires you to have an access token that is authorized. So here we can set up our access token, for example, having a bearer token. And if you don't understand, don't worry. I'm just saying if you want to add a header to your request, that's how you do. And you use the header access token, and you use the headers parameter, and you can add any headers that you want. And you can see here that there was a authorization key that was added to my headers. Where it's interesting is sometimes you will try to fetch that API a lot of time, and you don't necessarily want to add the headers each time. So in this case, you can use the session object. So instead of making a request, you can make a session. So you make requests, and then you initialize a session object. And that session object can then be used to crawl, to add. So you add only your access token once to your session. So what you're doing is you're going to the session and you define the headers, and you say update the header by adding the access token. And now what's interesting is here is you can make as many requests as you want by using, instead of using the requests here, you use a session.get method, and then you can essentially, if you look at your response, we can essentially fetch that response, and you're gonna see that the headers was added to any kind of request we made using that session. So this can be useful to fetch an API a lot of time without requesting more. So if you like that video, subscribe to my channel and share a lot, and just go to my blog, subscribe to my newsletter, and just subscribe to everything I do. You're gonna be very satisfied by that. So enjoy your day or night or whatever you are, and have a good one.